Dr. William Thompson's scalpel stopped mid-incision, his steady surgeon's hand frozen above the patient's exposed back. The expected fatty tissue wasn't there. Instead, something metallic glinted under the harsh operating room lights. Something that shouldn't exist inside a human body. The surgical nurse gasped audibly, her instrument tray clattering to the floor as she stumbled backward. The anesthesiologist's monitor began beeping frantically, reflecting the chaos now consuming Operating Room 3. Senior residents crowded closer, their faces pale with disbelief. On the patient's ring finger, a simple gold wedding band caught the light, a reminder that someone's husband, someone's father, lay unconscious while his deepest secret was literally being unearthed. 33 years of marriage, and his wife had never known what her husband carried inside his body. "Get the family," Thompson commanded, his voice barely steady. "They need to see this." What had this man survived? And how had he lived 3 decades with a bullet slowly working its way toward his spine? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, James "Jimmy" Mitchell sat in his worn leather recliner on the screened porch of his modest ranch house in Clearwater, Florida, watching another sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The empty chair beside him, Helen's chair, remained untouched since her funeral 8 months ago. Her reading glasses still lay folded on the side table, marking a page in a romance novel she'd never finish. At 65, James maintained the rigid discipline of his Marine Corps days. Every morning at 0530 hours, he brewed black coffee in the same chipped mug Helen had given him 20 years ago, read the Tampa Bay Times cover to cover, and performed 50 push-ups in the living room where Helen used to do her morning yoga. His silver hair remained military short, his weathered hands still steady despite the arthritis that reminded him daily of his advancing years. The house felt too big now, too quiet. Rooms that once echoed with Helen's laughter and the chaos of family visits had settled into a suffocating silence. James wore Helen's wedding ring on a chain around his neck, unable to bear leaving it in the jewelry box, but too heartbroken to put it away completely. The gesture seemed fitting. She'd always said he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. His son David called every Sunday at precisely 1400 hours, their conversations following the same stilted pattern. Weather updates, brief mentions of the grandchildren, polite inquiries about James's health that never delved too deep. David lived in North Carolina with his wife Sarah and 8-year-old twins, Emma and Jake, a 3-hour drive that might as well have been 3,000 miles given how rarely they visited. The lump on James's back had started as nothing more than a tiny bump 6 months ago, something he'd dismissed as another sign of aging. But lately, it had grown to the size of a golf ball, creating a constant ache that radiated down his spine and disrupted his sleep. Night sweats soaked through his undershirts, and sometimes he'd wake up calling out names that David wouldn't recognize. Rodriguez, Martinez, Thompson. Ghosts from a desert war he'd supposedly left behind decades ago. Helen would have marched him to the doctor by now, would have sat in that waiting room with her crossword puzzles and worried expression until she had answers. But Helen was gone, and James had grown expert at avoiding mirrors when changing shirts, at sleeping on his stomach to ease the pressure, at convincing himself that tough Marines didn't need doctors for every little ache. In his bedroom closet, pushed far back behind Helen's dresses that still smelled faintly of her perfume, sat an unopened box of war memorabilia. Inside lay medals he'd never displayed, photographs he'd never shared, and commendations for actions he'd never discussed, not even with Helen during their 33 years of marriage. Some things, James believed, were better left buried in the past, just like the growing pain in his back that whispered of secrets his body had kept for far too long. Labor Day weekend arrived with the unexpected rumble of a rental car in James's driveway. He looked up from his morning coffee to see David climbing out of a silver SUV, followed by Sarah and the twins. James hadn't expected them. David usually called before visiting, maintaining the same military precision that ran in their family. "Surprise, Grandpa!" Emma and Jake shouted in unison, racing across the yard toward the screened porch. James forced a smile, setting down his mug and rising to meet them, despite the sharp pain that shot down his spine with the movement. "Well, I'll be damned," James muttered, then caught himself. "Language, Jimmy." He could almost hear Helen's voice correcting him. "What brings you all down to this old man's corner of paradise?" David approached more cautiously, his army captain's bearing evident in every step. "Thought it was time for a visit, Dad." "Kids have been asking about their grandfather." The words carried an undercurrent of concern that James pretended not to notice. Sarah hugged him gently, her nurse's training evident in the way she assessed his appearance. "You've lost weight, Jim. Are you eating enough?" "I'm fine, just fine," James deflected, ruffling Jake's hair. "How about we fire up the grill? Can't have my grandchildren visiting without a proper barbecue." The afternoon unfolded with forced normalcy. James played catch with the twins in the backyard, their laughter temporarily filling the void that Helen's absence had left. Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, preparing side dishes with the efficiency of someone accustomed to military family life. David observed everything with the watchful eyes of a soldier, noting details that worried him. As the sun began its descent, James reached for the hamburger flipper on the grill's side shelf. The movement sent a lightning bolt of agony through his back, so intense that his knees buckled. He stumbled forward, catching himself against the grill, his shirt riding up in the process. "Dad, what the hell is that?" David's voice cut through the evening air like a blade. James straightened quickly, tugging his shirt down, but it was too late. David had seen the golf ball-sized protrusion pushing against the fabric of his father's shirt. "It's nothing, just a cyst," James said, his voice carrying the authority he'd once used to command Marines. "Been there a while, no big deal." "That's not nothing, Dad. That's serious." David moved closer, his concern overriding his father's protests. "When's the last time you saw a doctor?" "I've survived worse than a little bump, son. Hell, when I was your age—" "Stop." Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. She'd moved to stand beside David, her medical training evident in her expression. "Jim, Helen would want you to get this checked." "You know she would." The mention of Helen hit James like a physical blow. He retreated toward the garage, seeking refuge among his tools and memories. David followed, his patience wearing thin. "You've been pushing us away since Mom died," David said, his voice rising. "We're your family. Let us help you." "I raised you to be independent," James shot back. "A man handles his own problems. Your mother worried enough for both of us. I won't have you doing the same." "What if this is cancer?" David's voice cracked slightly. "What if we lose you too? Those kids in there have already lost one grandparent this year." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Through the garage window they could see Emma and Jake playing on the swing set Helen had insisted James install years ago. Sarah appeared in the doorway, having followed the raised voices. She took James's weathered hands in hers, her touch gentle but insistent. "The kids need their grandfather. Don't make them lose two grandparents in 1 year." Before James could respond, Emma's voice drifted from the backyard. "Grandpa, why does your back hurt? I saw you make that face when you bent over." Jake chimed in with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Are you sick like Grandma was? Is that why Daddy looks worried?" The innocence in their questions shattered James's defenses. He saw Helen in Emma's earnest brown eyes, heard her voice in the way Sarah spoke with such gentle authority. Helen had made him promise during those final days in the hospital to take care of himself. "I'll take care of myself if you promise to get better," he'd whispered to her then, holding her hand as machines beeped around them. "All right," James said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll make an appointment." David exhaled slowly, relief evident in his posture. "Thank you, Dad." "Probably just old war wounds catching up with me," James added, then immediately regretted the words when he saw David's puzzled expression. "War wounds? Dad, you always said you were never in combat." James turned away, busying himself with organizing tools that didn't need organizing. "Figure of speech, son. Just a figure of speech." The following Tuesday morning found James sitting in the sterile waiting room of the local VA clinic, surrounded by fellow veterans whose own battles with age and old injuries were written in their postures and expressions. A man with a Purple Heart cap dozed in the corner chair, while another veteran discussed his latest physical therapy session with a buddy who nodded knowingly. James remained silent, studying the motivational posters on the walls that proclaimed "Service never stops" and "Heroes helping heroes." Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a no-nonsense physician in her 50s who'd spent 2 decades treating veterans, called James into her examination room. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her eyes held the kind of compassion that came from years of listening to stories that men like James rarely told. "Mr. Mitchell, let's take a look at what's been bothering you," she said, her voice gentle but professional. James removed his shirt reluctantly, exposing the angry-looking protrusion that had grown increasingly painful over recent months. Dr. Reynolds' expression shifted from routine concern to genuine alarm as she examined the lump. Her fingers probed carefully around the edges, and James winced as she applied pressure to different areas. "How long has this been growing?" she asked, making notes on her tablet. 6 months, maybe more," James admitted. "Started small. Helen, my wife, she would have dragged me in here months ago, but she's been gone since January." "I'm sorry for your loss," Dr. Reynolds said sincerely. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to ask some questions. Have you experienced any night sweats, unexplained weight loss, or difficulty sleeping?" James nodded reluctantly. "All of the above, Doc. But I figured it was just grief. Losing Helen has been—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Any history of injury to this area? Motor vehicle accidents, falls, anything like that?" "Not that I remember," James said, but even as the words left his mouth, something nagged at the back of his mind. Desert heat, the smell of cordite, pain exploding across his back. But the memory slipped away like smoke before he could grasp it. Dr. Reynolds stepped back, her expression troubled. "I'm going to order some imaging studies. This doesn't feel like a typical lipoma or cyst. There's something unusual about the density and the way it's positioned." An hour later, James found himself in the radiology department, lying face down on the cold table of an X-ray machine. The technician, a young man who couldn't have been much older than David, positioned the equipment with practiced efficiency. "Try to stay perfectly still, sir," the technician said. "This will just take a few minutes." As the machine hummed to life, James closed his eyes and tried to ignore the growing sense of unease that had settled in his stomach. The antiseptic smell of the hospital was triggering something, fragments of memories that felt both foreign and familiar. When the imaging was complete, James returned to Dr. Reynolds' office to wait for results. The minutes stretched into an hour, and he found himself staring at the photographs on her desk, pictures of what looked like her own family, children and grandchildren gathered around a Christmas tree. It reminded him painfully of holidays at his own house when David was young, when Helen would orchestrate elaborate celebrations that filled every room with warmth and laughter. Dr. Reynolds finally returned, carrying a large manila envelope and wearing an expression that James recognized from his own military experience. The look of someone about to deliver difficult news. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, settling into her chair across from him, "the imaging results are unusual. What we're seeing doesn't match any typical soft tissue growth." She pulled the X-ray films from the envelope and clipped them to the light board on her wall. Even to James's untrained eye, something was clearly visible, a dense, irregularly shaped object nestled deep within the tissue of his back. "This appears to be a metallic foreign object," Dr. Reynolds said carefully. "Based on the size and shape, I'd estimate it's been there for quite some time. Years, possibly decades." James stared at the image, his mind reeling. "Metallic? What kind of metallic?" "I need to ask you again, were you ever wounded overseas? Any military injuries that might not have been properly documented?" "Doc, I've been trying to remember, but—" James rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. "I was in the Gulf War, but I don't remember being wounded. I came home in one piece, or at least I thought I did." Dr. Reynolds leaned forward, her expression both concerned and intrigued. "Mr. Mitchell, what we're looking at here appears to be consistent with a bullet fragment. The imaging suggests it's been encapsulated by scar tissue, which is why it hasn't caused more serious problems until now." The word bullet hit James like a physical blow. Suddenly, the room felt too small, too hot. His hands began to shake, and he gripped the arms of his chair to steady himself. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I would remember being shot. A man doesn't forget something like that." "Trauma can affect memory in complex ways," Dr. Reynolds said gently. "Sometimes the mind protects us from memories that are too difficult to process." She reached for her phone. "I'm referring you to Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington. They have specialists who deal with cases like this, old combat injuries that have remained dormant for years. You'll need surgical consultation to determine the best course of action." As Dr. Reynolds made the appointment, James sat in stunned silence, staring at the X-ray that revealed a secret his own body had kept from him for over 3 decades. Somewhere in the back of his mind, names echoed like distant thunder. Rodriguez, Martinez, Thompson, names that meant something important, something he'd spent 33 years trying to forget. When he finally called David that evening, his voice was barely steady. "Son, they're sending me to Walter Reed. They found something they can't explain." "What kind of something, Dad?" James looked at the referral papers in his hand, at the word bullet written in Dr. Reynolds's neat handwriting. Something that shouldn't be there. The drive to Washington, D.C. stretched before James and David like a journey into the unknown. David had taken emergency leave from his Army posting in North Carolina, and the weight of unspoken questions filled the rental car as they traveled north on I-95. James sat in the passenger seat, watching the familiar landscape of the South give way to the rolling hills of Virginia, his mind wrestling with fragments of memories that seemed to surface and disappear like ghosts. "Dad, you've been quiet for the last 100 miles, David said, adjusting the rearview mirror to glance at his father. "What's going through your head?" James was silent for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I keep trying to remember, son. 33 years, and there's this blank space in my memory, like someone took an eraser to part of my life. The doctors said trauma can do that," David offered, his voice careful. "Maybe your mind was protecting you from something. Maybe." James stared out the window at a convoy of military vehicles heading south. "Your mother used to say I talked in my sleep, especially around the anniversary of when I came home from the Gulf. She'd wake me up sometimes, said I was calling out names she didn't recognize." David's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What names?" "Rodriguez. That one came up a lot, according to Helen. And Martinez, Thompson. But when I'd wake up, it was all gone, like trying to hold on to water." They stopped for lunch at a roadside diner in Richmond, one of those places that still served coffee in thick white mugs and displayed photos of local high school football teams on the walls. James picked at his burger while David studied his father with the careful attention of someone trained to assess personnel under stress. "Dad, I've been thinking about something," David said, setting down his coffee cup. "When I was a kid, you never talked about your service. Most veterans I know, they share stories eventually. War stories, funny incidents, something. But you, it was like those years just didn't exist." James nodded slowly. "Your mother asked me about it once, early in our marriage. I told her there wasn't much to say. Went over, did my job, came home. End of story. But it wasn't the end, was it?" "I thought it was." James's voice was barely above a whisper. "I really thought it was." Walter Reed Medical Center loomed before them as they arrived that evening, its imposing brick buildings and military efficiency immediately triggering something in James's nervous system. His breathing became shallow as they walked through the main entrance, past the portraits of military leaders and displays honoring wounded warriors. The antiseptic smell, the sound of rubber-soled shoes on polished floors, the controlled chaos of a military medical facility. It all felt familiar in a way that made his skin crawl. "You okay, Dad?" David asked, noticing his father's pale complexion. "Fine. Just tired from the drive," James lied. But his hands were trembling as they approached the reception desk. Their hotel that night was a modest chain establishment near the medical center. David had booked 2 rooms, but James found himself knocking on his son's door around midnight, unable to sleep. "Nightmares?" David asked, opening the door to find his father standing in the hallway in his pajamas and Marine Corps t-shirt. "Not exactly nightmares," James said, entering the room. "More like echoes. Pieces of things that might be memories, or might just be my brain playing tricks on me." They sat on the edge of David's bed, father and son illuminated by the glow of the bedside lamp. For the first time in years, James looked vulnerable, older than his 65 years. "Tell me," David said simply. "Desert heat," James began, his voice distant. "The taste of sand in everything you eat, everything you drink, the weight of gear on your back, sweat stinging your eyes, and voices, young voices. Kids, really, barely old enough to shave, calling me Gunny, looking to me for answers I'm not sure I had." He paused, rubbing his temples. "There's this one voice that keeps coming back. Rodriguez, high-pitched, nervous laugh. Talked about some girl back home named Maria. But beyond that," James shrugged helplessly. "Nothing. It's like trying to remember a dream after you've been awake for hours." David reached over and squeezed his father's shoulder. "Maybe tomorrow's appointment will help shake something loose. The doctors at Walter Reed see this kind of thing all the time." The next morning brought their appointment with Dr. William Thompson, a military surgeon whose reputation for handling complex combat-related injuries had made him a legend at Walter Reed. Thompson was younger than James had expected, maybe 45, with graying temples and the kind of steady hands that inspired confidence. His office was decorated with commendations and photographs from various deployments, and James found himself studying a picture of Thompson with a group of young soldiers in Afghanistan. "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Thompson said, reviewing the file that had been sent ahead from the VA clinic. "I've looked at your imaging studies, and I have to say, this is one of the more interesting cases I've encountered in my 20 years here." He clipped James's X-rays to the light board and pointed to the metallic object clearly visible in the films. "What we're looking at appears to be a bullet, probably .45 caliber based on the size and shape. It's completely encapsulated in scar tissue, which suggests your body has been containing it for a very long time." David leaned forward in his chair. "How long are we talking about?" "Based on the degree of calcification and tissue formation around the object, I'd estimate it's been there for decades. 20, 30 years minimum." Dr. Thompson turned to James. "Mr. Mitchell, you served in the Gulf War?" 1990 to 1991, James confirmed. But doctor, I swear to you I don't remember being wounded. Wouldn't a man remember getting shot? Dr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. You'd be surprised how often we see this. Combat situations involve massive amounts of adrenaline, shock, sometimes blood loss that affects consciousness. It's entirely possible to sustain an injury and have no clear memory of it, especially if other traumatic events were happening simultaneously. He turned to a computer terminal and pulled up additional scans. What's remarkable about your case is how well your body has adapted. This bullet has essentially been walled off by your immune system. It's created what we call a fibrous capsule around the foreign object, preventing infection and limiting damage to surrounding tissue. So why is it causing problems now? David asked. Several factors, Dr. Thompson explained. Age, changes in bone density, the natural settling and shifting that occurs in the body over time. The capsule has grown, and it's now pressing against nerve pathways that weren't affected before. Without intervention, you'll likely experience increasing pain and potentially nerve damage. James absorbed this information in silence, his mind reeling with the implications. A bullet in his back for 33 years. Doctor, James said slowly, if this bullet is from the Gulf War, there should be military medical records, right? Documentation of the injury? Dr. Thompson's expression grew more serious. That's where things get complicated, Mr. Mitchell. I've already reached out to records management, and your official medical file shows no combat injuries, no bullet wounds, no field hospital admissions for anything more serious than dehydration. How is that possible? David demanded. It happens more often than you'd think, Dr. Thompson said carefully. Combat situations, especially during the intensity of the ground war in 1991, sometimes resulted in incomplete documentation. Field medics dealing with mass casualties, patients evacuated unconscious, classification issues. There are a dozen reasons why an injury might not make it into official records. He paused, studying James's face. There's another possibility. Sometimes injuries occur during classified operations. In those cases, medical records might be sealed or sanitized to protect operational security. The room fell silent as the weight of this possibility settled over them. James felt something stirring in the depths of his memory. Not a clear image, but an emotion. Fear. Not fear for himself, but fear for someone else. Someone young, someone whose laugh he could almost hear. Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to recommend surgical removal of the object, Dr. Thompson continued. It's a relatively straightforward procedure, though we'll need to be careful given the location and the amount of scar tissue that's formed around it. There are risks, infection, nerve damage, bleeding, but the alternative is continued deterioration and increasing pain. James nodded slowly. When? I can schedule you for tomorrow morning. I'd like to get this taken care of quickly before the pressure on those nerves causes any permanent damage. As they left Dr. Thompson's office, James felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. Finally, he would have answers. But part of him wondered if those answers would bring more pain than the bullet itself ever had. That evening, they ate dinner at a quiet restaurant near their hotel. James ordered a beer, possibly his last for a while given the upcoming surgery, and found himself studying David's face across the table. Son, he said finally, I want you to know something. Whatever they find in that operating room tomorrow, whatever memories come back or don't come back, you're the best thing I ever did with my life. You and those grandchildren of mine. David's eyes misted slightly. Dad, let me finish, James interrupted gently. I know I haven't been the easiest father to understand. Hell, I haven't understood myself most of the time. But your mother saw something in me worth loving, and she gave me you. That's enough legacy for any man. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of 30 years of unspoken emotions finally finding voice. "Whatever happened over there, Dad, it doesn't change who you are to us," David said finally. James smiled sadly. "I hope you still feel that way tomorrow night, son. I really hope you do." The morning of surgery arrived gray and overcast, with September rain pattering against the windows of Walter Reed Medical Center. James had been awake since 0400 hours, his internal military clock refusing to acknowledge that he no longer had reveille to answer. He sat in the preoperative holding area wearing a hospital gown that made him feel more vulnerable than any enemy fire ever had, David beside him reviewing surgical consent forms with the methodical attention of a man trying to control the uncontrollable. "Mr. Mitchell?" A young nurse approached with a clipboard and that practiced smile that medical personnel use to calm nervous patients. "I'm Jennifer, and I'll be taking you back to the OR in just a few minutes. How are you feeling?" "Like I'm about to find out who I really am," James said, the words surprising him with their honesty. Dr. Thompson appeared in surgical scrubs, his presence immediately commanding respect from the surrounding staff. "Good morning, James. Ready to solve this 30-year mystery?" James nodded, though his hands were trembling slightly. "Doctor, I need to ask you something. When you remove that bullet, is there any chance it might trigger memories? Things I've blocked out?" "It's possible," Dr. Thompson said carefully. "Anesthesia sometimes affects the brain's ability to suppress traumatic memories. Some patients report vivid dreams or flashbacks during recovery. We'll have psychiatric support available if needed." David squeezed his father's hand. "I'll be right here when you wake up, Dad. Whatever you remember or don't remember, we'll handle it together." As they wheeled James toward the operating theater, he caught a glimpse of the American flag hanging in the corridor and felt an unexpected surge of emotion. Somewhere in the fog of his suppressed memories, he could almost hear young voices singing cadence, boots marching in unison, the sound of helicopters overhead. Rodriguez. The name echoed in his mind like a prayer or a curse. The operating room was a symphony of controlled chaos. Surgical instruments gleamed under bright lights, monitors beeped steadily, and the surgical team moved with the precision of a military unit. Dr. Thompson took his position at the table while the anesthesiologist prepared the medications that would render James unconscious. "Count backward from 10 for me, Mr. Mitchell," the anesthesiologist said, placing the oxygen mask over James's face. 10, 9, Rodriguez, get down. 8. James's voice faded as the anesthesia took hold, but not before everyone in the room heard him call out that name with the urgency of a man trying to save a life. Dr. Thompson made the initial incision with practiced precision, following the surgical plan they'd discussed the night before. The tissue parted cleanly, revealing layers of scar formation that told the story of a body's decades-long battle to contain a foreign invader. "Remarkable," Dr. Thompson murmured to his surgical team. "Look at this encapsulation. This patient's immune system has essentially created a biological safe around this object." As they worked deeper into the tissue, the true extent of the body's adaptation became clear. The bullet hadn't simply lodged in muscle, it had become integrated into James's anatomy, surrounded by a complex network of blood vessels and nerve pathways that had grown around it over the years. "Dr. Thompson," the surgical nurse said, her voice tight with concentration, "we're getting some unusual bleeding here. More than expected." "I see it," Thompson replied, adjusting his approach. "This scar tissue is more vascularized than the imaging suggested. The body has been supplying blood to this area for decades." The surgery that was supposed to take 90 minutes stretched into its third hour. In the waiting room, David paced like a caged animal, calling Sarah every 30 minutes with updates that contained no real information. Other families sat in similar vigils, the universal anxiety of loved ones in surgery creating an unspoken bond among strangers. Back in the operating room, Dr. Thompson finally reached the object itself. "There," he said, his voice filled with the satisfaction of a puzzle finally being solved. "Let's see what we've got here." Using delicate forceps, he carefully extracted a deformed piece of metal that had once been a .45 caliber bullet. The projectile was heavily oxidized and partially fragmented, its surface telling the story of 3 decades inside a human body. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the surgical residents. "How did he survive this?" Dr. Thompson examined the bullet under the surgical lights, noting the trajectory and the way it had impacted bone before coming to rest. "This entered from the posterior aspect, probably while he was prone or crouched. See how it fragmented against the vertebra? Another few millimeters and it would have severed his spinal cord." The extraction left behind a cavity that had to be carefully cleaned and irrigated. Years of contained infection had created pockets of fluid that needed to be drained, and the surrounding tissue showed signs of chronic inflammation that the body had been fighting silently for decades. "How's his blood pressure?" Dr. Thompson asked the anesthesiologist as they worked to control bleeding from vessels that had grown around the bullet site. "Stable, but I'm seeing some unusual brain activity on the EEG. Almost like he's dreaming, but the patterns are more intense than typical surgical dreams." In the depths of anesthesia, James was indeed dreaming, but these weren't the peaceful visions that usually accompanied medical sleep. He was back in the desert, 25 years old again, leading a reconnaissance patrol through terrain that intelligence had assured them was clear of enemy forces. The memory unfolded with crystalline clarity. Rodriguez' walking point, nervous as always, but determined to prove himself. Martinez covering the left flank, Thompson on the right. The oppressive heat that made every breath feel like swallowing fire. The weight of gear that seemed manageable in training but felt crushing in the field. "Gunny, we got movement ahead," Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio, high-pitched with adrenaline. "How many?" James heard his younger self respond. "Can't tell. Maybe 3, maybe more. They're dug in good." The ambush came without warning. Muzzle flashes from concealed positions. The distinctive crack of AK-47 fire, bullets whining off rocks around their position. James watched himself assess the situation with the cold calculation of a professional warrior. "Rodriguez, Martinez, suppressing fire on the left. Thompson, flank right. Move!" But Rodriguez froze. James could see it happening as if watching a movie. The young Marine paralyzed by his first taste of real combat, standing exposed in the killing zone while enemy fire converged on his position. Without thinking, James threw himself forward, tackling Rodriguez and driving them both toward cover behind a boulder. The bullet that would have killed Rodriguez punched into James's back instead, the impact driving him face first into the sand even as he shoved his Marine to safety. "Gunny's hit!" someone screamed. Thompson, maybe, or Martinez, but James kept moving, kept fighting, adrenaline masking the pain as he directed his team's response to the ambush. Only later, when the enemy position was overrun and the immediate danger had passed, did the shock and blood loss finally claim him. In the operating room, monitors began beeping more urgently as James's vital signs fluctuated. His blood pressure spiked, his heart rate increased, and his breathing became irregular despite the ventilator. "He's fighting the anesthesia," the anesthesiologist reported. "It's like his body is reliving trauma." Dr. Thompson looked up from his work, concerned. "How much longer do you need?" "Almost done. Just need to finish the irrigation and close." As they completed the surgery, James's memories continued to unfold. He remembered the helicopter evacuation, the field hospital, the harried medic who told him the bullet was too deep and too close to vital structures to remove safely. "We'll mark it in your record," the medic had said. It'll work its way out eventually, or your body will adapt. Happens all the time. But something had gone wrong with the paperwork. The chaos of the ground war, the classification of their mission, the fact that James had been unconscious during most of his treatment, somehow his injury had fallen through the cracks of military bureaucracy. "Surgery's complete," Dr. Thompson announced, holding up the extracted bullet for the surgical team to see. "Let's get him to recovery." As they wheeled James out of the operating room, David jumped to his feet in the waiting area. Dr. Thompson emerged, still wearing his surgical cap, fatigue evident in his posture but satisfaction in his expression. "How did it go?" David asked immediately. "Successfully, but not without complications," Dr. Thompson said, leading David to a quiet corner of the waiting room. "The bullet is out, and your father should make a full recovery. But David, what we found in there, this wasn't just a random injury. The trajectory, the location, the way it fragmented, your father was hit while protecting someone else. This was the wound of a man who threw himself into harm's way." David felt tears he hadn't expected stinging his eyes. He saved someone? Based on the forensic evidence from the wound, I'd say he definitely saved someone's life. And nearly died doing it. James awakened in the recovery room with the taste of desert sand in his mouth and tears streaming down his face. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed blindingly bright after 33 years of darkness, and for a moment he couldn't distinguish between the beeping of hospital monitors and the sound of incoming artillery that echoed in his newly awakened memories. "Dad? Dad, can you hear me?" David's voice cut through the fog of anesthesia and trauma, anchoring James to the present moment. "Rodriguez?" James whispered, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube. "Is Rodriguez okay?" David exchanged concerned glances with the recovery room nurse. "Dad, you're in Walter Reed. The surgery is over. Dr. Thompson got the bullet out." But James wasn't listening. His eyes were wide and unfocused, staring at something only he could see. "I told him to get down. I told him to take cover." But he just stood there, frozen like a damned statue. The memories flooded back with devastating clarity. Every detail that his mind had suppressed for 3 decades now blazed in vivid, painful color. The weight of his gear in the desert heat, the nervous laughter of 19-year-old Luis Rodriguez from Brownsville, Texas, who wrote letters to his girlfriend Maria every night and carried her picture in his helmet. The way Rodriguez's hands shook during his first firefight. The split second when James realized the kid was going to die unless someone acted. "I remember everything," James said, his voice breaking. "God help me, I remember it all." Dr. Thompson appeared at his bedside, checking his pupils with a small flashlight. "Mr. Mitchell, you're experiencing some breakthrough memories. This is not uncommon after this type of surgery. Can you tell me what you're remembering?" "March 15, 1991, James said with the precision of a man reciting coordinates. "Al-Khafji sector, reconnaissance patrol, 4 Marines under my command." His breathing became labored as the full weight of memory crashed over him. "Rodriguez, Martinez, Johnson, and Thompson. Good Marines, young Marines, too damn young." David pulled a chair closer to his father's bedside. "What happened, Dad?" James closed his eyes, but the images were burned into his retinas now, as clear as if they were happening in real time. "Intel said the area was clear. Always said the area was clear. But Charlie was waiting for us. 3, maybe 4 positions. Crossfire. Perfect killing zone." His hands began to tremble as he relived those terrifying moments. Rodriguez was walking point. Kid was scared. Hell, we all were scared. But he was trying so hard to prove himself. When the shooting started, he just froze, standing right there in the open, bullets kicking up sand all around him. "So, you saved him," David said softly. "I tried to save him," James's voice was barely a whisper now. Threw myself at him, drove him behind cover, felt something punch into my back, but the adrenaline. I kept fighting. Had to get my Marines out of there. The heart monitor began beeping faster as James's agitation increased. Dr. Thompson moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary, but James continued his painful recollection. We fought our way out, called in air support. Dust-off came and got us. But Rodriguez? James's voice cracked completely. That stupid brave kid went back. Went back where? David asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. Martinez was hit, bleeding out in the open. And Rodriguez? After I saved him, after he was safe behind cover, he went back for Martinez, just like I taught him. Never leave a Marine behind. James was sobbing now, 33 years of suppressed grief pouring out of him. I watched him get cut down 20 feet from safety. Watched him die trying to be the Marine I taught him to be. The recovery room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors and James's ragged breathing. David felt his own eyes filling with tears as he began to understand the weight his father had carried all these years. Dad, you saved him once. He made his own choice to go back. But he died, James shouted, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. He died because I taught him that bullshit about never leaving anyone behind. He died because he wanted to make his sergeant proud. He was 19 years old, David. 19. Had his whole life ahead of him. Dr. Thompson stepped forward, his voice calm and professional. Mr. Mitchell, what you're experiencing is survivor's guilt. It's extremely common among combat veterans. You did everything right. Everything right? James laughed bitterly. I came home. Rodriguez came home in a body bag. Martinez came home in a wheelchair. Johnson never came home at all, died 2 weeks later from his wounds. Thompson. Christ, I don't even know what happened to Thompson. David reached for his father's hand, but James pulled away. Don't you understand? I survived because a 19-year-old kid took the bullet that was meant for me. I've been living Rodriguez's life for 33 years. That's not true, Dad, isn't it? James's eyes were wild with pain and guilt. I came home and married Helen. Had you built a life? And all the while, Rodriguez was rotting in a grave in Texas, and his girlfriend Maria was learning to live without the boy she loved. The breakdown was complete now. 33 years of suppressed trauma erupting like a dam bursting. James curled into a fetal position on the hospital bed, his body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. I should have died in that desert, he whispered. Rodriguez should have come home to Maria. Should have had kids and grandkids, should have grown old and told his own war stories. Instead, he's dead, and I'm here, and for what? So I could spend 30 years being too broken to tell my own wife what was wrong with me? David felt helpless in the face of his father's anguish. Dad, Mom loved you. She knew you were hurting, and she loved you anyway. She loved a lie, James said bitterly. She loved a man who let her think he was whole when he was really just pieces held together by guilt and shame. Do you know what it's like to wake up screaming and not be able to tell your wife why? To have her hold you while you cry and not be able to explain that you're crying for a kid who died because you taught him to be a hero? Dr. Thompson motioned for the psychiatric nurse to join them. This level of emotional breakdown required immediate intervention. Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Thompson said gently, you're in shock right now. These memories have been suppressed for decades, and they're hitting you all at once. We're going to give you something to help calm you down, and then we're going to connect you with someone who specializes in combat trauma. Don't you dare drug me, James snarled, his Marine Corps authority cutting through his grief. I've been numb for 30 years. I need to feel this. I need to remember Rodriguez. I owe him that much. David looked at his father with new eyes, seeing not just the man who had raised him, but the young Marine who had thrown himself into harm's way to save a fellow soldier. "Dad, you didn't fail Rodriguez. You gave him the training and the courage to try to save Martinez. That's not failure. That's honor." "Honor?" James laughed harshly. "You want to know about honor? Honor would have been dying in Rodriguez's place. Honor would have been bringing all my Marines home alive. Honor would have been telling your mother the truth about why I woke up screaming her name every night for the first 10 years of our marriage." The psychiatric nurse approached with a mild sedative, but James waved her away. "I'm done running from this. I'm done pretending it didn't happen. Rodriguez deserves better than that. They all deserve better than that." As the immediate crisis began to subside, James lay back against his pillows, emotionally and physically exhausted. The bullet was gone, but the wound it had hidden was now fully exposed, raw and bleeding after 33 years of concealment. "David," James said quietly, "I need you to help me find Rodriguez's family. I need to tell them what really happened. I need to tell them that their boy died a hero and that his sergeant has been carrying his memory every day since." David squeezed his father's hand, this time without resistance. "We'll find them, Dad. We'll find them together." 3 days after the surgery, David sat in the hospital cafeteria with his laptop, methodically searching through military databases and veteran websites while his father slept under sedation upstairs. The psychiatric evaluation had been brutal. James cycling between catatonic silence and explosive outbursts of grief that left him physically and emotionally drained. Dr. Sarah Chen, the staff psychiatrist, had warned David that his father was experiencing what she called compressed grief, 33 years of suppressed trauma erupting all at once. David's fingers moved across the keyboard with military precision, typing search terms that had become painfully familiar. Luis Rodriguez, Gulf War, KIA 1991, Al-Khafji. The results were frustratingly sparse. A few mentions in casualty reports, a brief entry in a military cemetery database, but nothing that revealed the human story behind the statistics. Then, buried in the 15th page of search results, David found it, a memorial website created by Rodriguez's family. The page opened with a photograph that made David's breath catch. A young Marine in dress blues, barely old enough to shave, with earnest dark eyes and a nervous smile that somehow conveyed both vulnerability and determination. "Corporal Luis Miguel Rodriguez," David read aloud to himself. "Born December 3, 1971, Brownsville, Texas. Died March 15, 1991, Al-Khafji, Saudi Arabia. Beloved son, brother, and novio of Maria Elena Santos." The website contained dozens of photos spanning Rodriguez's short life: Little League baseball, high school graduation, boot camp pictures, and finally, formal military portraits. But it was the section titled "Letters Home" that made David's hands tremble as he scrolled through digitized copies of handwritten letters Rodriguez had sent to his family. February 28, 1991. "Dear Mama, we're getting ready to move north. My sergeant, Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell, says we're ready for anything. He's the best Marine I've ever met. Makes me want to be better than I thought I could be. Tell Maria I love her, and I'll see her soon. Tu hijo, Luis." David stared at his father's name on the screen, written in a young man's careful cursive 33 years ago. Rodriguez had been writing about James just 2 weeks before he died, and James had carried the guilt of that death every day since. Further down the page, David found what he was looking for: contact information for the Rodriguez Family Memorial Fund, managed by Luis's younger sister, Carmen Rodriguez Valdez. David picked up his phone and dialed the number before he could lose his nerve. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered, warm but cautious. "Miss Rodriguez Valdez, my name is David Mitchell." "My father is James Mitchell. He was your brother's sergeant in the Gulf War." The silence on the other end stretched so long that David wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Carmen's voice came through, barely a whisper. "Sergeant Mitchell? My God, we've been trying to find him for 30 years." 24 hours later, Carmen Rodriguez Valdez and her 70-year-old mother, Elena Rodriguez, sat in the waiting area outside James's hospital room. Elena clutched a worn leather portfolio containing letters, photographs, and documents that had become sacred relics in their family's history. "He doesn't know you're coming," David warned them as they prepared to enter the room. "He's been in a very fragile state since the memories returned. The psychiatrist thinks it might help him to meet you, but we need to be careful." Elena Rodriguez was a small woman with silver hair and eyes that held 3 decades of grief, but also an unmistakable strength. "Mijo," she said to David, using the Spanish endearment that Rodriguez had probably used for his younger comrades, "your father saved my son's life. Whatever pain he's carrying, we carry it too." James was awake when they entered, staring out the window at the gray October sky. He turned at the sound of footsteps and froze when he saw Elena Rodriguez's face, older now, lined with years and sorrow, but unmistakably the mother whose photograph Rodriguez had carried in his wallet. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" James's voice was barely audible. Elena approached his bed slowly, as if she were approaching something sacred. "Sergeant Mitchell, we've been looking for you for so long." "I'm sorry," James whispered, tears already streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. I failed him. I failed your son." Elena Rodriguez did something that shocked everyone in the room. She laughed, a sound filled with both sorrow and relief. "Failed him? Sergeant, you gave my Luis the most precious gift a mother could ask for." "I don't understand," James said, confusion replacing some of his anguish. Carmen stepped forward and opened the leather portfolio. "Sergeant Mitchell, what do you know about what happened after Luis died?" "Nothing," James admitted. "I was unconscious when they extracted us. When I woke up in the field hospital, they told me about the casualties, but no details. Then everything got classified, and I couldn't get information about what happened to my Marines." Elena pulled out a yellowed document, an official military citation. "This is the Bronze Star Medal with Valor that Luis received posthumously. Would you like me to read the citation?" James nodded, unable to speak. Elena's voice was steady despite her tears. "For heroic achievement in connection with military operations against an armed enemy." Corporal Rodriguez, observing that a fellow Marine was critically wounded in an exposed position under heavy enemy fire, voluntarily left his position of safety to render aid. Despite receiving mortal wounds, Corporal Rodriguez succeeded in moving the wounded Marine to safety before succumbing to his injuries. His selfless actions were directly responsible for saving the life of Lance Corporal Martinez. Corporal Rodriguez's extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Marine Corps. "He saved Martinez," James whispered, the words hitting him like a physical blow. "Yes," Carmen said, pulling out another document. "Martinez survived because of what Luis did. He lost his leg, but he lived. He got married, had kids. He's a teacher now in El Paso." Elena reached into the portfolio again and pulled out a letter written on military letterhead. This came from Martinez 3 months after the battle. "He was in the hospital in Germany, and he wrote to us about what happened." She unfolded the letter carefully and began to read. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I don't know if anyone has told you the whole story about how your son died, but you need to know that Luis died saving my life. I was hit bad and bleeding out in the open. The sergeant, Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell, was already wounded, but Luis just looked at me and said, 'Nobody gets left behind.' That's what the sergeant taught us. Luis ran through enemy fire to get to me, dragged me to cover. He was shot 3 times doing it, but he kept moving until I was safe. The last thing he said to me was, "Tell the gunny I remembered what he taught us. Mrs. Rodriguez, your son died as the finest Marine I ever served with." James was sobbing openly now, his body shaking with the force of emotions he'd suppressed for 3 decades. "He remembered what I taught him," he repeated through his tears. "There's more," Elena said gently. She pulled out a small, worn photograph, a picture of Rodriguez and Martinez together, both grinning at the camera, arms around each other's shoulders. "Martinez sent this with the letter. He said Luis was always talking about making the sergeant proud." Carmen leaned forward. "Sergeant Mitchell, my brother didn't die because you failed him. He died because you succeeded in teaching him what it meant to be a Marine. He died saving someone else because that's what you taught him to do." Elena reached for James's hand. "For 30 years our family has been trying to find you. Not to blame you, to thank you. Luis wrote to us about you in every letter. He said you made him brave when he thought he was a coward. He said you believed in him when he didn't believe in himself." "But he was just a kid," James protested weakly. "He was 19, Elena said firmly. "Old enough to choose to be a hero, old enough to choose to honor the training you gave him." "You didn't make him die, Sergeant. You made him live with honor." Carmen pulled out one final item from the portfolio, a Bronze Star medal, its ribbon still bright despite the years. "This belonged to Luis. Mama has kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment." She held it out to James. "She wants you to have it." "I can't," James said, recoiling from the medal. "I don't deserve it." Elena Rodriguez stood up and moved closer to James's bed. With gentle but firm hands, she placed the medal in his palm and closed his fingers around it. "Luis wrote to us about you in his last letter home. He said his sergeant was the kind of Marine he wanted to be when he grew up. He said you taught him that being scared was okay, but running away wasn't. You gave my son the courage to die as a hero, Sergeant Mitchell. You gave him the strength to save another mother's child." For the first time in 33 years, James felt something other than guilt when he thought about Rodriguez. It was still painful, still filled with grief for a young life cut short, but now it was mixed with something else: pride. Pride in the Marine he had trained, pride in the man Rodriguez had chosen to become in his final moments. "He was a good Marine," James whispered, clutching the medal against his chest. "He was the best Marine," Elena Rodriguez replied, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Because you made him one." As the Rodriguez family prepared to leave, Elena paused at James's bedside one final time. "Sergeant, will you do something for us?" "Anything," James said without hesitation. "Stop carrying guilt that isn't yours to carry. My Luis came home a hero because of you. He just came home in a box instead of on a plane." But he came home a hero, and that's all a mother can ask for. After they left, James lay in his hospital bed holding Rodriguez's Bronze Star, feeling the weight of it in his palm. Not the crushing weight of guilt he'd carried for 30 years, but the honored weight of a young Marine's sacrifice. For the first time since the surgery, he wasn't crying tears of anguish. He was crying tears of relief, of gratitude, and of a grief that could finally begin to heal. 6 months later, the April sun cast long golden rays across the back porch of James's Clearwater home as he sat in his favorite chair, the same one where he'd once stared at Helen's empty seat with nothing but grief and regret. Now that chair was occupied by his 8-year-old granddaughter Emma, who was carefully helping him arrange photographs in a leather-bound scrapbook that had become their Saturday afternoon project. "Tell me about this one again, Grandpa," Emma said, pointing to a faded photograph of a young Marine in desert camouflage, his arm around James's shoulders. Both men were grinning despite the harsh desert backdrop, their faces showing the easy camaraderie of soldiers who trusted each other with their lives. "That's Corporal Rodriguez," James said, his voice steady and warm in a way it hadn't been for decades. We called him Luis. He was about the bravest young man I ever had the honor to serve with. And he saved someone? Jake asked from his position on the porch swing, where he was supposedly reading a book about Marines, but was obviously listening to every word his grandfather said. He did, James confirmed, turning the page to reveal Martinez's wedding photo. A picture the former Lance Corporal had sent just last month, along with a letter thanking James for reaching out after all these years. He saved his friend Martinez, who got to go home and become a teacher and get married and have children of his own. Emma traced her finger along the edge of Rodriguez's photograph with the solemnity that children reserve for truly important things. "Grandpa, are you sad that he died?" James considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, it would have destroyed him. Now, after months of therapy with Dr. Chen and countless conversations with David, he could answer with something approaching peace. "I'm sad that he died so young," James said. "I'm sad that he never got to marry his girlfriend Maria or have children or see his mama grow old. But I'm not sad about the way he died, sweetheart. He died doing what Marines do, taking care of each other." David appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with glasses of sweet tea and wearing the relaxed expression of a man who no longer worried constantly about his father's emotional state. The transformation in James over the past months had been remarkable, not a return to who he was before, but an evolution into someone new, someone who had finally learned to carry his memories without being crushed by them. "Dad, there's someone on the phone for you," David said, setting down the tray. "Says his name is Thompson, Bill Thompson. Says he served with you." James felt his heart skip a beat. Thompson had been the 4th member of their patrol, the one whose fate had remained unknown through all the years of James's guilt and searching. Over the past months, with the help of the Rodriguez family and various veteran organizations, James had been slowly tracking down the surviving members of his unit. "Kids, why don't you take your drinks inside and see what Aunt Sarah is cooking for dinner?" James suggested, already reaching for the phone. "Sergeant Mitchell?" The voice on the other end was older, roughened by years and cigarettes, but James recognized it immediately. "Thompson? Bill Thompson from 2nd Battalion? Jesus Christ, Gunny, I've been looking for you for 30 years. Thompson's voice was thick with emotion. "I saw your name on one of those veteran websites and I couldn't believe it. Where the hell have you been?" James settled back in his chair, the phone cradled against his shoulder. "Florida, mostly. Married, raised a son, lost my wife last year. Been dealing with some issues from the old days." "Al Kafji?" "Yeah, Al Kafji." There was a long pause before Thompson spoke again. "Gunny, I need to tell you something about Rodriguez and Martinez, about what really happened after you went down." James felt his chest tighten, but not with the old familiar panic. "I know about Rodriguez, Thompson. I know he went back for Martinez. I know he saved him." "Do you know why he went back?" "Because I taught him never to leave a Marine behind," James said, the words carrying both pride and sorrow. "No, Gunny. That's not why." Thompson's voice was urgent now, desperate to finally tell a truth he'd been carrying for 3 decades. "Rodriguez went back because of what you did. When you threw yourself on top of him, when you took that bullet, you didn't just save his life. You changed him. I watched it happen." James gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "After the medics got you stabilized and on the bird, Rodriguez just sat there in the sand, covered in your blood, shaking like a leaf. He kept saying, 'The Gunny took a bullet for me. The Gunny took a bullet for me.' And I could see something happening in his head, you know, like he was figuring out what it meant to be worth saving." Thompson's voice grew stronger, more certain. "When Martinez got hit 20 minutes later, Rodriguez didn't hesitate. He looked at me and said, 'If I'm worth the Gunny's life, then Martinez is worth mine.' That's why he went back, Sergeant. Not because you taught him some rule about not leaving people behind, because you showed him what it meant to value another person's life more than your own. James felt tears running down his cheeks, but they weren't tears of guilt or anguish. They were tears of understanding, of a puzzle piece finally clicking into place after 33 years. "Thompson, where have you been all these years?" "Here and there. Did 25 years in the Corps, retired as a master sergeant. Been working with a veterans group in Arizona, helping guys like us deal with what we brought home." Thompson paused. "Gunny, I want to ask you something. There's a ceremony next month at the Marine Corps War Memorial in D.C. They're dedicating a new section for Gulf War veterans. Rodriguez's family is going to be there, and Martinez is flying in from El Paso. We want you there, too." "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that," James said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. "You're ready," Thompson said with the confidence of a Marine who'd seen his sergeant face impossible odds. "Hell, Gunny, you've been ready for 30 years. You just needed to remember who you are." After the call ended, James sat on the porch as the sun set over the Gulf of Mexico, watching his grandchildren play in the yard while David and Sarah prepared dinner in the kitchen. The sounds of family life, laughter, conversation, the clatter of plates and silverware filled the spaces that had been empty for so long. Helen's reading glasses still sat on the side table next to her chair, but now they were joined by other mementos. Rodriguez's bronze star in a place of honor, letters from Martinez and his family, photographs from the memorial website that Carmen Rodriguez Valdez had helped him access. The past was no longer a source of pain to be avoided, but a part of his story to be honored and remembered. "Grandpa?" Emma appeared at his elbow, her small hand slipping into his weathered one. "Daddy says dinner's ready, and he says we can look at more pictures after we eat." "That sounds perfect, sweetheart," James said, allowing her to help him up from his chair. As they walked toward the house together, he noticed that the constant ache in his back, the pain that had plagued him for months before the surgery, was completely gone. The bullet was out, the wound had healed, and his body had finally learned to carry only the weight it was meant to bear. Inside, the dining room table was set for 6, with an extra chair that Sarah always left empty. Not for Helen, as James had once assumed, but for any unexpected guest who might need a place at their table. It was a tradition she'd learned from her own military family, a recognition that those who serve never really stop serving, never really stop taking care of each other. As they sat down for dinner, James looked around the table at his family. David and Sarah, who had refused to give up on him even when he'd given up on himself. Emma and Jake, who would grow up knowing their grandfather not as a broken man haunted by war, but as a Marine who'd learned to transform grief into gratitude. "Before we eat," James said, raising his glass of sweet tea, "I want to make a toast. To family, to second chances, and to the Marines who taught an old sergeant that sometimes the greatest honor isn't surviving the battle, it's learning to live with the victory." As glasses clinked around the table and conversation resumed, James felt a peace he hadn't experienced since before that March day in 1991. Rodriguez was still gone, would always be gone, but his sacrifice had meaning beyond the tragedy of a young life lost. It had taught James that love, for family, for fellow Marines, for the very idea of service, was worth any price, even the price of a bullet that had taken 33 years to heal. The bullet was gone, but the lesson remained. Sometimes the things we carry longest are the things that ultimately save us. For 33 years, James Mitchell carried more than just a bullet in his back. He carried the crushing weight of survivor's guilt, the unbearable burden of believing he'd failed the young Marines under his command. Like so many of our generation who served in distant wars, he came home physically intact but emotionally shattered, unable to share his pain even with the woman he loved most. The tragedy wasn't just that Rodriguez died saving a fellow Marine, it was that James spent 3 decades believing that heroic sacrifice was his failure rather than his greatest success as a leader. How many of us carry similar wounds? How many nights have we awakened our spouses with names they don't recognize, memories we can't explain, guilt we can't release? James's journey from devastating guilt to healing grace reminds us that our bodies and our hearts keep score of everything. But love always wins in the end. Sometimes it takes 33 years to find the courage to heal, but it's never too late to discover that our greatest perceived failures might actually be our most profound gifts to others. The scars we carry aren't just reminders of pain. They're proof of our capacity to survive, to love, and ultimately, to heal. What memories from your service years do you still carry that might need healing? Have you ever discovered that something you thought was your failure was actually your greatest gift to someone else? Share your story in the comments below. Your courage to speak might be exactly what another veteran needs to hear today.